Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit's. So I got a chance to play the upcoming Warhammer title Vermintide from Fat Shark, which is of course based in the Warhammer Fantasy End Times era. And I wanted to show you some content, needless to say, from the beta version of it and talk a little bit about my thoughts based on the time that I've had with the game so far. The game has a limited beta running at the moment. They're releasing a new round of beta invites on the 30th of September, and the game will be coming out officially on October the 23rd. It shouldn't really require much explanation at this point, but just in case people miss it, this is a beta version, meaning that it is not fully optimized, there are things missing, and it's not necessarily representative of the final product. In particular, you will notice in some of the more busy scenes, some frame rate drops from 60. The game has optimization issues that they are continuing to work on at the moment, and it does not have SLI support or indeed driver support from Nvidia at present. So the frame rates are lower than they're expecting from the final version. Needless to say, however, those drops are absolutely a concern and something that will need to be rectified before the game comes out. So what is Vermintide? Well, it is a co-op first-person action game. It is not a co-op first-person shooter because, as you have probably noticed, many of the characters are in fact wielding melee weapons, and melee is a key component of the game. All characters have both a melee and ranged weapon, and their loadouts can be customized. We'll talk a little bit more about that and the way that loot works a little bit later on in the video. To start with, we've got 5 classes available. We have the Sigmar Soldier, who wields a blunderbuss and a large two-handed warhammer by default. We have a stocky dwarf ranger, who by default wields a one-handed axe and a shield, and a crossbow as his secondary. And we've got the Witch Hunter, who wields a rapier, and also has a brace of pistols, including a pistol that is attached to the rapier itself, so a lot of gunplay coming out of that. You then have a Wood Elf, who is primarily focused on bows, but also wields dual knives by default, and last but by no means least, the Bright Wizard, who uses a sword, but her most potent weapon is her staff by default, which allows her to attack with firebolts at range, and also charge up for a very effective AoE fireball, great at clearing out crowds. In addition to these weapons, you will be able to pick up other weapons and loot, which will change your playstyle with different attacks and weapon styles. You'll also be able to grab secondary items such as potions, various kinds of bombs, and of course healing supplies. The goal of the game, unsurprisingly, is to reach the end of the level, and the length of levels very much varies depending on which one you happen to go onto. Some of the levels can be over in about 10 minutes, whereas others can stretch onto half an hour, perhaps even 40 minutes, with multiple events and all sorts of different things going on as you attempt to traverse the level and complete the objectives. So let's talk a little bit about the combat first, perhaps the meat of any sort of co-op horde-focused game, and of course it should be, because that's what you're going to be spending the vast majority of your time doing. If the combat isn't interesting, then the game is going to get very boring very fast, and there are plenty of dull horde co-op games available. Loads of them. Vermintide seems like it might be one of the few which actually does combat very, very well and does it in a way that's quite interesting, and the way that it does that is, of course, to focus on melee for the most part. The vast majority of horde-based games don't do that. Indeed, the vast majority of first-person games don't do that. First-person melee combat is quite hard to get right, and as a result, most games have attempted to shy away from it, and those that have attempted it have got mixed results. Let's just put it that way. There are some games I think that did it really well. Chivalry is a great example of that. Dishonored to some degree. Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. All that sort of thing. Vermintide actually does melee combat pretty damn well. So the way the combat system works is relatively simple in melee. You have a regular attack, which of course can be chained together to create multiple hit combos. And you also have an attack that you can charge up by holding down the left mouse button. Now, as to what that attack does, it really varies based on which weapon you happen to be using. You're going to be seeing a couple of different classes throughout this video, and you'll see some different weapon sets as a result. But for example, if you're using the Witch Hunter's Rapier, the charged attack is a pinpoint accurate armor-piercing stab, which is useful for taking down tough armored enemies, whereas the Dwarf's Hammer and Shield combination does a big sweeping shield bash, which does area area of effect damage in a cone in front of you, and also has a knockback effect as well. So it varies depending on which weapon you have. Some weapons also have a special attack, such as the rapier for the witch hunter. If you hit the special attack button, it will actually fire a pistol, which is held in tandem with the sword itself. So it gives you a little bit of flexibility there, and that also happens to have its own ammo count, so it can be used in a pinch when your main brace of pistols runs out of ammo. The game also has a dodge and block system. When you block with a melee weapon, depending on which melee weapon you use, you'll get a number of shield icons pop up. And that represents the number of times you can block before your block will be forced down for a little while. So you can't just sit there blocking. Obviously, if you're using a sword and shield or something along those lines, you're going to have a much more effective block that can last a lot longer. Although, depending on the kind of attacks that you're taking, it is possible that really, really large attacks can actually break your block entirely, such as attacks from boss characters. While you're blocking, you can also shove back, which is a key part of, say, playing a tanky kind of character. You'll be able to shove away all the enemies around you, and since this game is taking the term horde mode rather literally, you are often going to be surrounded by a large number of enemies, so that shove is key, and you also have a dodge move, which allows you to jump backwards and to the side in order to try and get away from enemies. The ranged combat is far more self-explanatory. Depending on the weapon, you're either going to be aiming down sights with something like the crossbow or some of the larger guns, or you're going to be able to simply fire with the left mouse button over and over again until you're out of ammo, or in the case of the Bright Wizard, you are going to be heating up your overcharge bar, and if you heat it up too far, well, you kind of explode, so you may wish to avoid that if you possibly can. Some of the ranged weapons also have different fire modes. For instance, the Witch Hunter, if you hold down the right mouse button, will draw 2 pistols at once and will rapid fire. You can barely move while you're doing it, but it's a good way to not only waste that pesky ammo that you didn't want to carry around anyway, but also cut down a large number of enemies in a horde. In addition to that, you can also find bombs and things around the level, which allow you, needless to say, to blow things up. There are various kinds of bombs, they are consumed upon use, and they generally do a large amount of area effect damage of some description. My initial impressions of the combat system are, for the most part, positive. The melee system has a good amount of weight behind it. Different attacks have different effects, depending on what side you swing from, for instance. You know, an overhead attack is very effective at breaking helmets and, of course, decapitating enemies, and the sweeping attacks generally hit multiple opponents, so that makes a lot of sense. And there's a little bit of depth in there with the special attack and learning when to use the charge attacks as well. Since they take quite a long time to charge up, you can leave yourself fairly vulnerable when you're doing it, so a degree of timing is required. I found the melee combat to be very responsive. The blocking worked exactly as I thought it would. You know, I can block at the last second to deflect a powerful blow from a big opponent. That always worked well. I didn't feel like the game was lagging behind my inputs at any point, which was awesome. The only issue that I've got really with the melee combat is something that perhaps they'll be able to sort out, but I noticed quite a bit of clipping. The clipping through models, for instance. You found yourself in the middle of a big horde of enemies, and particularly when they're doing their dying animations, it's actually possible for you to sort of clip through them inside of the model, which is a little bit awkward. It doesn't really affect the gameplay all that much, but it absolutely affects the presentation. It looks a little bit sloppy. That's the sort of thing that needs to be cleaned up. Otherwise, though, I really enjoyed the melee combat. I tried out all sorts of different melee weapons, and they were all pretty damn enjoyable, and the game has a large selection of them. So let's talk about that weapon selection for a little bit. The game's going to start off with 5 classes, the ones that I mentioned earlier. They did mention there were plans for DLC for more classes, needless to say. Now, as you're playing, you'll gain experience, which contributes to an overall account level, which will allow you to unlock different weapons, and it will also give you access to different features. The first feature available is a forge, which lets you customize weapons, upgrade them, and scrap stuff you don't need in order to get materials and perhaps a chance of a rarer item. Now, there is item rarity in the game. This game does have loot. Now, the way the loot works is that at the end of every level, you get this little dice game. And you can earn dice throughout the level by performing different feats and activities. Some of them are optional objectives. Think about the lawn gnome challenge, the garden gnome, that you could do in Left 4 Dead. Well, they have a sort of similar system, but they've integrated it into the way that the loot works. So there are optional challenges which make the game run more difficult. For instance, you could pick up a tome. Now, a tome doesn't help you in any way, and it actually takes up the slot that would be used by medical supplies. So it makes the game a bit riskier. But if you manage to get some tomes to the end of the level, they will reward you with bonus dice in the dice game. The more dice you've you've got, and there are special kinds of dice which give you higher chance at loot, the better loot you will acquire when you actually beat the level. You do only acquire loot if you beat the level. If you lose, you'll still get experience, and sometimes when you level up, you will get access to different weapon sets, but if you want to start to get the really good stuff, the rares, and the weapons with different stats and traits, then you're going to want to be winning and hopefully getting some good dice rolls at the end of it. I do like the dice game, actually. It's quite thematic, considering that Warhammer has been about dice for decades now, so I think that it would certainly appeal to those of us that enjoyed the tabletop games. And it's also got that nice pack opening feeling. You know, that little satisfaction of opening a crate or opening a pack in another game. You get that here. Now, you can't buy those dice. You get them as in-game rewards only. So just bear that in mind. There's no pay to win or anything going on here. Now, when I spoke to the developers as to how exactly they're doing their loot progression, they said that they want all the weapon sets to feel fairly balanced, but also feel different. So each class has a unique feel to them, but let's say you wanted to make the dwarf more of a ranged character, you actually can do that. There are dwarven ranged weapons available that are more effective, perhaps, than the default crossbow. So you can kit your dwarf out to be more of a ranged guy, you can kit your elf out to be more of a melee guy, all that sort of thing. You can customize your playstyle through the weapons that you pick up, and they're each going to have different abilities and different attributes, and they've also got stats. Now, in addition to that, they're also going to have traits and different passive effects, so things like lifesteal and drain, and there are weapons that set enemies on fire or poison them, all that sort of thing. And that's where the main progression of the game lies. Horde mode games often focus on progression as a form of replayability. The only game that really didn't do a lot of that was actually Left 4 Dead, but games like Killing Floor, as well as perhaps lesser games such as God Mode, which was absolutely awful, they have a lot of progression in them because they want you to keep playing the levels multiple times. The way that they've done it this time is all about loot collection. It's about finding the best weapons, customizing the weapons that you have, upgrading them, and all that sort of thing. And I find that really compelling, as well as, again, thematic for the world. You know, it's Warhammer. Warhammer is a tabletop battle game, but it's had a lot of RPG, either mechanics or actual games released under it, whether they be tabletop games, pen and paper role-playing games, or actual video games. So throwing an RPG element in there is effective, I think. It works with the theme, and it's also a good way of getting people to keep playing the game. When I was speaking to the devs, they did stress that they don't want weapons to be too far ahead of each other. Yes, if you have a really epic weapon or something, it's probably got a bunch of effects on it, but they don't want that weapon doing like 3 times the damage of a regular weapon, because they want you to be able to jump into games with your friends and not have a situation like, say, Payday, where someone can be really far ahead of everybody else, and as a result, the level becomes unbalanced or less enjoyable for everybody. So that's how they're doing that. I think it's a pretty effective way of doing it, although my fear is that it'll mean that they don't go too far with some of the effects that are on those weapons and make them a little bit less enjoyable or desirable. I have no doubt that many of you have played games like Diablo and Torchlight and all that sort of thing, and there is a great joy in getting a weapon with a bunch of effects. I didn't really get a chance to see any of the special weapons because all of my loot rolls just got me commons, unfortunately, so I'll try and play a little bit more of the beta and see what I can find out about that, but that's just my concern with it. I think the system's great, honestly. I think it's a really good way of getting people to keep playing and also get them to experiment with different play styles. There are plenty of games that do progression in a very linear fashion and they just ramp up the power. I think that increasing the variety of weapons that you get initially is going to keep people interested, and then once they figure out exactly what they like, they're going to start trying to collect the rarer versions of it that have some nice traits. So I think that's good. I really do think that will add to the replayability. It will certainly help with the issues I had with Left 4 Dead, which didn't really have something like that. And some people will argue that's a strength because they don't really like to be on the loot grind and the treadmill, and in some cases, I agree with them. But in this case, I think that the loot system is a good idea. Now, what about how the missions actually play out? Well, you can access the missions through the hub area, which is a tavern, which has a map and various facilities that you can use. You gather there, you can change out your hero there, and then you all agree to go to a particular map and fight there. So there is a bit of a storyline connection, but it seems to be relatively loose. Now, you go into the level and you start progressing, you're given an objective, a destination, and occasionally you'll come across special events. So there'll be an event which says, hey, you've got to blow up this gate, so get 3 explosive barrels from this location over there. Except if you get attacked, the barrels explode, so you've got to have everybody work as a team to have that happen. Outside of that, of course, you're going to be killing Skaven, who are the primary antagonists of this game. There are various regular Skaven types with different weapons and different characteristics, but there are also special Skaven types, and this is where the Left 4 Dead comparison is going to be very apt. Every now and again, a special Skaven will come along, and he's got an ability that's going to cause you problems. The Gutter Runner is almost the same as the Hunter in Left 4 Dead, so he's going to jump on somebody, he's going to keep stabbing at them until a teammate comes along and kills him. There are also Skaven with hooks that can drag you away from the party. There are Skaven, the Globadiers, the Poison Globadiers, that can throw globes of poison at you, which, needless to say, are area of effect, although they can also be used against the Skaven themselves by kiting the Skaven into the poison cloud. And there are Gatling gunners who will focus on a particular target and fire away at range. The interesting thing about that is they get very focused on one person, so you can use line of sight to block their attacks, or you can even block it with a shield while somebody else comes in from the flank and stabs him in the head. There are big boss characters. We ran into a rat ogre a couple of times. Those things are pretty vicious and fairly hard to deal with. Needless to say, they have multiple attacks, and that's the sort of thing that you will need to get everybody together to deal with. You'll also fight armored enemies, storm vermin, and all that sort of thing mixed in. That's very Left 4 Dead. However, there was one thing that I noticed which I found particularly interesting, and that is the Storm Vermin patrols. So, at certain points during a level, there will be a patrol of armored ratmen. Big guys, big halberds, armor, everything. And a lot of them as well. Generally speaking, you do not want to fight them, unless you really want a challenge, because a lot of those guys will murder you. So, that adds an element of situational awareness into the game where you have to be paying attention and making sure that you don't run into a patrol. You want to run and hide, stay out of their line of sight, and wait for them to pass you. Now, the game has a sort of AI director that will determine when these things happen, so it's randomized every level, so you're not entirely sure when they're going to come at you or whether they're going to come at you at all. So it stops you from just mindlessly slaying your way through the entire level. You have to pay attention, otherwise a Storm Vermin patrol can jump on you, spot you, and then you're in real trouble. Of course, if you don't beat the mission, then you don't get loot, you just get experience, so there is a great deal of impetus on you to not screw up. If you happen to go down, then you have a certain amount of time before you bleed out, and you can be revived by your teammates. Of course, with one player down, it's entirely possible that your defensive formation will collapse and everything will go horribly wrong very, very fast. The game does have a couple of healing items that you can get. You can get a sort of med pack, which you can use on other people, and a healing draft, which is an instant, which will restore 50% of your health. There are also situations where you can end up dangling off a cliff or something along those lines, and someone will have to come and rescue you. Very Left 4 Dead-esque, you know. The game definitely wears its inspirations on its sleeve, there's no doubt. But let's be honest, you know, Left 4 Dead came out several years ago, and it really is about time that we see more good games within that particular genre. I mean, Left 4 Dead 2 is almost 6 years old now, if you can believe that. It doesn't seem that long ago, does it? Maybe it is time that we see more games in the genre that are competent, because there are plenty that are not. So in terms of enemy variety, I think it's reasonable enough. You know, you're constantly on the lookout for specials. You have to deliberately keep an eye out for that sort of thing, because a special can really ruin your day. If you're caught away from your group, then you can be in big trouble and all that sort of thing. And of course, if you stay too close to each other, then you get nuked by the Poison Globadiers. So it's something that constantly keeps you guessing, and the hordes of Skaven are still pretty damn satisfying to fight, honestly, and I think that's because of the melee focus. I found the process of killing infected in Left 4 Dead to be a little bit laborious, even in Left 4 Dead 2, which did have a melee system, but almost all the melee weapons kind of acted the same, and the game wasn't really focused on those. Whereas this game has focused on melee, and I think that's to its credit. The active blocking and dodging and all that sort of thing, as well as the positional play that is involved in Vermintide, means that the combat, for me anyway, is a bit less repetitive, and the opportunity to change up your playstyle through unlocking new weapons and loot is something that I hope will keep me playing it. I do have a little bit of a concern in terms of pacing. Now, we played a short level, but we also played a couple of fairly lengthy levels that were like 20 to 30 minutes, and what I felt is that these levels could be well served by better punctuation in terms of events, yeah? We were running only into about 1 or 2 special events that were focused around objectives throughout the entire run. I think a couple more of those would help break up the monotony of move to here, kill this stuff, move to here, kill this stuff, all that sort of thing. That's the challenge when you're playing a horde mode game whose matches last quite a long time. The way Killing Floor dealt with it is to have your power ramp up, but also ramp up the power of the enemies throughout. So you started with your basic pistol, and you got to earn money to buy better weapons, but of course, you had to contend with better enemies as a direct result of that. So that's how it escalated, and it had a boss fight at the end. Vermintide doesn't escalate quite as much, and I think that's mostly because it follows the Left 4 Dead formula of a mix of regular dudes with the occasional special vermin every once in a while, and maybe there'll be a rat ogre boss that comes out of nowhere that you have to deal with. So that's the formula that they go for. There's usually a climactic event at the end of every level, such as hold the line while the boat comes, or something like that, you know. Hold the line waiting for reinforcements, or of course escape to the wagon to get out of this area, that sort of thing. So that does happen, but there were definitely lengthy periods where I felt like we were doing the same thing over and over again, and it could have maybe, just maybe, done with a little bit more spice, a little bit more variety, occasional events more regular than the ones that we got during the playthrough of the beta. The one thing I did like about this is that the game is very class-focused, whereas some other horde-based games are less about that. It seems like the classes are more homogenous. Left 4 Dead in particular, it's like there are no classes there. All the characters basically do the same thing, and of course, you can pick up a shotgun, or you could pick up an assault rifle, or a sniper rifle, but that's really about as far as the variety goes. Here, I really felt like we were working as a team based on everybody's strengths. Once I played the dwarf with the hammer and shield, I was getting at the front, I was being the guy that would stand in front of everybody else, I was deliberately disrupting the group of enemies, and I was also trying to tie up the special vermin in combat so that my somewhat squishier brethren wouldn't have to worry too much about getting horribly murdered. At the same time, we had a Bright Wizard who was using her AoE as I was forcing the enemies into a group. She was nuking them and all that sort of thing. We had an archer who was picking people off at range who would focus on ranged enemies for the most part and pick them off before they could do too much damage. So it definitely felt like there was a lot of class synergy there and synergy between the different weapon types, and everybody kind of had a role, but we were still reasonably flexible. Like, even as the dwarf, I had ranged ability. It wasn't very good, you know, it's just a basic crossbow, but I could take out a basic enemy in one shot. I could do decent damage to guys with headshots and all that sort of thing. So if I found myself out of combat, then I could still help out before I was able to get into melee range. So that was good. And even when I was playing the Bright Wizard, I was still able to do damage with my sword, absolutely. The Bright Wizard's an interesting one, actually, because she uses this overcharge mechanic that I was talking about, which means you have to be very careful with managing your resources and not overdoing it. You're a very powerful character that can blow up a large number of enemies at once, but as your heat level rises, it will become abundantly clear that you can't keep doing this. And if you actually top out your heat level, you literally explode. Simple as that. Now, this can actually take out a number of enemies, but of course it also knocks you out. So you can do a little bit of a suicide move if you so desire, which I think is a kind of a neat idea. It's a cool way to balance a very powerful character and also force you to be a little bit conservative with those really powerful abilities. The game also rewards you for exploration, which I like a lot. There isn't an obvious indicator as to where your objective is, so you kind of have to explore to find it, but as you explore, you will also come across chests and you'll come across bonuses, so you can pick up those tomes that I was mentioning earlier. You can get bonus dice, you can find those hidden around the level. There are also, of course, health kits, bombs, consumables, potions, and ammunition, which you'll probably need to scavenge from various buildings in order to keep your team at full strength. It seemed like each level was loaded with little nooks and crannies and alleyways that you could go down in order to try and find consumables and bonuses, but of course it was also a bit risky because the Skaven have a tendency of jumping on you from behind. You know, that's actually what I really liked about the Skaven and the way that they've been done in this game. They act like Skaven. They're not just a generic enemy, they are individually cowardly, but also quite sneaky, and they're vicious pack animals, so they will try and hoard you when they get the opportunity to do that. If you actually approach a single one, the chances are they'll actually actually run and try and hide or try and alert the others instead of trying to fight you, because that's exactly what a Skaven would do. Also, they like to focus from either coming up from the ground or from the ceilings. They like to jump down, so you have to bear that in mind. They're very good at climbing, so if you're on a cliff face, you'll often be facing a horde that are climbing up, and of course you can shield bash them right off the cliff again. That's pretty good. You always have to keep an eye on the roofs as well to make sure that they don't jump on you and murder one of your teammates. So I found the enemies to be surprisingly satisfying to take out as a direct result of that. And there's nothing better than a game that gives you a horde of enemies and a big AoE hammer to smash their heads in with. The physics are a little dodgy in places, but they're mostly satisfying. Some really good ragdolls. You can do things like chop off the Skaven's tail. Limbs go flying everywhere. Decapitation is obviously very effective. You can pulp somebody's head. You can chop it off with a sharp implement, and sometimes the Skaven will even still try and attack you when the head's gone off. They'll sort of flail at you for a few seconds before they finally fall over. So there's a lot of visceral satisfaction to be had from the combination of a good melee system and some really good damage modeling and visual gory feedback. The actual game itself looks pretty good as well. It's a more advanced version of the engine that they've been using previously, BitSquid. I believe it was bought by a different company and it's now had its name changed, and obviously it's been improved and advanced in many ways, but I was impressed particularly by the lighting effect. It's worth noting that some of the lightning isn't done yet, so if you notice any footage in this where you're thinking, why is the lightning making everything dark all of a sudden? Yeah, that's unfinished. Don't worry about that. They're still working on that at the moment, but I did want to show you a little bit of that level regardless because it was kind of cool. But graphically, it's quite good. You know, good lighting, good shadows. It's very important to have shadows, of course, if you're going to be having Skaven pouring from them. It's a decent looker, you know, with some nice effects. They do a particularly good job of the green, eerie glow of the warp stone, which I think is absolutely key if you're going to do any game about Skaven. So it feels like a Warhammer game. You know, it's not a tacked-on theme. It's like it was built from the ground to be a Warhammer fantasy game, and that the developers actually understand the aesthetic of Warhammer fantasy, which is very grim and dark, and also the specific little eccentricities, like the glowing green warp stone and all that sort of thing. The Skaven aesthetic looks really, really good. Now, everything about them looks exactly the way that I would expect, and there's a great deal of accuracy in the various player characters as well. I'd like to give special note to the particular barks and little comments and remarks that are made by the different characters. The Witch Hunter in particular is an arrogant, sarcastic arsehole, which is absolutely perfect. And they've really got the character right, I think, with the voice acting on each of those individuals. So in its current state, I'm pretty happy with it. Obviously, there's quite a lot of work to be done. Optimization is a key factor. Even on my system, I was noticing it dropping below 60, particularly in areas with very complex lighting and large hordes of enemies. Of course, if it's doing that on my system, then there are risks that on lower-end systems it will be a bit of a problem, but the game is very scalable. I was playing it on Extreme. There are a lot of options. It does include full field of view. It defaults to 65, which obviously I turned off immediately. The gameplay you're seeing is in 95. It actually goes past 100, which is great, so no simulation sickness problems for people there, although, of course, that's going to be a bit of a performance hog. Lot of scalable options, a couple of different kinds of AA, which is good. It's got TAA as well as FXAA. And what I liked is the fact that the options menu has tooltips as well. And it will tell you specifically which effect is likely to affect your machine the most. Like, it'll say this is a very heavy effect on the GPU, but it's very light on CPU. So you can figure it out. You know, if you've got a great graphics card, your CPU's maybe lacking a bit, you can scale down the CPU effects and crank up the GPU, or vice versa. So it's a very well-featured PC game, as far as I can tell, at least in its beta state. I'll obviously look at the options menu completely once I do the launch video. There's very little point in looking at beta options because they're all subject to change, but for the most part, I found that it had the options that I was looking for, and it was highly scalable. Now, as to what they're going to be doing once the game is out, they talked to me a little bit about the future plans. They intend to release both free and paid DLC. When I asked them as to whether or not they would be releasing additional characters, they said that that's definitely on the cards, so the default 5 are most likely going to be joined by other characters later down the line. And, of course, they're going to be releasing new enemy types. They're looking to release new maps and levels, and I imagine loot is a big factor as well. They said they've got about just over 8,000 loot combinations at the moment, and they're not randomly generated. They are handcrafted, so the different combinations are things that they figured out themselves. So there's a lot of different loot types available, which will, of course, affect your style of play, and they are scaled in terms of rarity. That, I think, is probably going to keep me playing it. Now, I'm definitely interested in playing this on launch. I enjoyed my time with the beta. It helps that I'm obviously into Warhammer, so the theme for me is great. Personally, I prefer 40k. I mean, hell, I would pay a lot of money for a 40k version of this. I really think that would be awesome. But in terms of fantasy, this is well put together, and it's nice that they picked an enemy type that is perhaps less well represented in most Warhammer fantasy games. You know, it's a lot of humans versus orcs a lot of the time, or humans versus chaos. So seeing Skaven is cool. They have a nice little variety of enemy types and all that sort of thing, so I think that was a good choice. The progression system is probably what will keep me playing. Getting loot, upgrading my characters through the acquisition of loot, and of course, fancy hats, which you can get, is the sort of thing that will keep me playing. And there are benefits to playing on higher difficulty levels, more experience, better drop rates, and all that sort of thing. So it has the replayability. They're planning to launch with, I believe, around 13 levels, and they expect to add a few more in as post-release DLC, so it seems like there's a decent amount of content available there. Just bear in mind that there is no single-player campaign, and there is also no versus mode either. It's a purely co-op game. You can play with bots, and I did, and they were reasonably competent, but I found the game far more enjoyable when we were coordinating as a team, spotting enemies and all that sort of thing. The game has in-game VoIP, and it also has the ability to highlight both items and enemies, so if you spot a special, you could say, hey, you know, there's a rat gunner over there, you know, we've got to take him down, or, oh, there's some ammunition over here, so go and get it. So if you don't want to be on VoIP, you do have basic forms of communication available, but I would imagine for the most part you'd probably want to be playing with friends. My conclusion on this, based on my play of the early beta, is that Vermintide is looking really, really good. You know, it's got AAA aesthetic and production values, and it also has this really enjoyable melee system that is not commonly found in this genre. It seems to understand exactly what makes Horde mode games interesting, and absolutely it has taken a lot of cues from Left 4 Dead. I mean, why would you not? It's the genre leader. But the focus on melee makes it feel like a fundamentally different game, and melee is not something that Left 4 Dead really did well, even with the melee weapons. And the addition of loot is just such a huge thing, as well as the class-driven gameplay. That, to me, is the sort of setup that I enjoy. That's the sort of setup that would keep me coming back and playing over and over again. And that's what I need from games like that. Horde mode games can get very repetitive if you're fighting the same number of enemies all the time. I would say that the game maybe shows its cards a little early. It does the same thing as Left 4 Dead does, which is it'll throw a lot of the special types at you within your first level of play. So you're not going to be really being surprised by enemy types later on down the line, which is a little bit of a shame. That said, if they want you to replay the levels multiple times, the last thing they'd want to do is create a level that's more mundane because it has less enemy variety in it. So I can kind of see why they did that. It would just be nice to be consistently surprised by new types. I'm hoping that they add more into the game. I mean, since it doesn't have a versus mode, I feel that maybe balancing the special types would be a little easier. Obviously, Left 4 Dead 2's versus mode is maybe my favorite mode in that game. You know, it's what I played far more. But if you keep adding special types in, then you can run into balance problems. This is purely PvE, so I don't really see the harm in continuing to add new types of enemies. I think that would be very good indeed. As an aside, by the way, just a special mention, because you know I do like to talk a lot about video game music. The soundtrack to this game is by Jesper Kyd. This guy's just a bit of a legend, frankly. He's been working on games since 1990, and you probably remember his music from games like Hitman Blood Money, Unreal Tournament 3, Assassin's Creed possibly being his most well-known work. You know, he worked on a lot of games, so it's good to see that Fat Shark didn't skimp on the music aspect of the game. So my conclusion. Pretty positive impression, honestly, based on my early play of it. It looks like they understand what makes a Horde mode game good and replayable. It's got a great theme, a great aesthetic, it has a nice mix of weapons and characters available, and the loot system is hopefully the hook which keeps people playing over and over again. It seems like it's going to be a really solid entry to a genre that, frankly, has a few good games in it and a lot of absolute tosh. They evidently took this one seriously, and that is a very, very good thing indeed. I will admit that I'm certainly a sucker for first-person melee. That's not something that's done all that often, and it's done even less often well. So the fact that this game does it well and it's satisfying to do is a huge deal to me. There you go, folks. Warhammer End Times Vermintide. So the release date for this is October the 23rd. The next round of beta invites goes out on September the 30th. I will no doubt cover this game once it has fully released, and then we can talk a little bit about its post-launch performance options and all that good stuff. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.